All right, welcome to the conversation on the Young Turks. So we got a great guest for you guys today. He's Mehdi Hassani, senior columnist for The Intercept. He also does a podcast for The Intercept called Deconstructed, and he's the host of Upfront on Al Jazeera English. Mehdi, great to have you back on, brother.
Thanks for having me on, Cenk. I hope you're safe and well and indoors.
We're all good. We're all good. Thank you. You wrote a piece about how the Trump administration might be trying to sneak in a war with Iran while we're not looking. So that's interesting. We're going to get to that in a second. But today, some folks are animated, I suppose as most days, on whether Bernie should withdraw from the race. There's a recent story out about it. What's your take, Mehdi, given the state of the race? Yeah,
it's a great question. I don't know the answer, to be honest. I think, look, if it was me, I would have pulled out because I don't see a path to victory. There's talk of him, looking at the Wisconsin result, and if he loses by more than 15 or 20 or 25 or whatever it is, that will, push him to pull out. He's been making noises about pulling out in recent media interviews that he's been doing. There's reports that Fayez Shaka, his campaign manager, and others have said pull out, whereas others are saying stay in. I get the argument for staying in because they want to have as many delegates as possible to influence the platform at this virtual convention that might now be happening in the summer. But look, the fundamental problem I have with this argument, whether he stays in or stays out, is he had a long time to go after Joe Biden. And my problem with Bernie Sanders during this campaign is he made it very clear he wasn't going to go after Joe Biden. He wasn't going to do what had to be done in order to win the nomination. And that means knock Biden down and keep him down. And neither he nor Elizabeth Warren did that. And Joe Biden managed to stay in the race on the margins. People wrote him off, and fair play to him. He comes back and wins on Super Tuesday. But the problem is, even at that debate, that last debate, the one debate we saw between Bernie and Biden, he pulled his punches, and I have a problem with that.
There is a very small path to victory, but that path includes fire and ice. It includes actually going after Biden, making the case aggressively for why you're the right candidate and he isn't. And if you're talking about that, especially at this late date, you got to do things that Bernie's not willing to do. So is Biden in mental decline? Certainly looks like it. I have eyes, I have ears, I can see it. I'm not a medical expert. I can't know it for sure, but I'm really, really worried about it. Am I really worried about it because of the primary? No, I'm really worried about it because of the general election.
Did you see did you see the Trump line over the weekend where they read out a tweet of Biden's and Trump just said, he didn't write that tweet. He has people writing it for him. He's not even watching now. If he did, he doesn't even understand what's going on. And the problem with that line of attack is, as shameless as it is, as gratuitous as it is, as hypocritical as it is, it resonates with some people because a lot of people say, we might hate Trump and he might be a hypocrite, but, there's a little, it's like with Hillary Clinton. There was a little bit of truth to those vicious attacks that he launched on her. Obviously, they were over the top, but there was some truth to the idea that she was an establishment politician. She liked wars. She liked Wall Street. The fact that Trump is all of those things and worse is irrelevant. That's not how politics works. And you hear a lot of liberals saying, well, he can't accuse Biden of being in mental decline. Look at his decline. That's not how it works, unfortunately. People aren't that fair.
Here's how it's going to go down. Even if the Biden team was tough enough to then make the videos about how Trump says oranges instead of origins and how he thinks wind causes cancer. And, he started at mental decline and has only gone down. But one, they won't be as vicious as they need to be. Two, they'll never be as vicious as Trump. Three, your best case scenario is a tie where people go, great, our two choices are two older white guys in mental decline. Great. Yeah. Thank you, Democratic Party. We really appreciate it.
And we know that low turnout helps the Republicans.
Are we going to lose? And I say we in this context. I'm a progressive. I'm going to vote against Trump. So has the Democratic Party made the same exact mistake as they did in 2016? And do we now stand an excellent chance of losing to Donald Trump again?
Definitely stand an excellent chance of losing to Donald Trump. When you say we, I would use we much more broadly. Are decent human beings, are non-racists, non-fascists going to lose in November to this racist, fascist, white nationalist? There's a lot at stake. He's an existential threat to American democracy and to minority communities in this country. It does, look at the polls. The polls suggest Joe Biden's going to win. of course, the polls also suggested Hillary Clinton was going to win. So the polls are a static snapshot of where we are today. There's a long time to go. A couple of months ago, if you and I are having this conversation, it would be a very different conversation. I wouldn't be sitting in my house having this conversation with you. So, things change very fast. But one constant is that Biden does look like he's a little bit past it. He doesn't look like he has the same energy that he did have in the past. I mean, you talk about vicious ads and going after Trump. One of Biden's advisors anonymously briefed the press last week that we can't attack Trump too hard right now. The American public doesn't want to see that. What? You don't want to attack the president right now who's literally getting Americans killed, who is handling this crisis in the worst possible way. If that is the attitude and mindset of Joe Biden, a guy who brags about working across the aisle, having Republican friends, calling Dick Cheney a great guy, giving eulogies at, racists' funerals, that's a problem. The only way he can win is, as you say, if he goes all out at Trump, takes advantage of all of Trump's weak spots. And I'll tell you what, the one change you have with 2016, and I wrote this piece over a year ago that Biden is Hillary 2.0, the one advantage he has is that Trump is a known quantity now in a way that he wasn't in 2016. And the second advantage he has is that he does seem to be doing better in the primaries, at least, with quote unquote white working class voters in the Rust Belt than Hillary Clinton did.
At the end of the day, I still have the refs as the number one problem. So you play a game, and it's not fair to ask one side to be, 20 points, 40, 50 points better than the other side when the refs call every call in one direction. So, and I say that in this context. So if Biden loses, as we are afraid he's going to Donald Trump, the mainstream media, in my opinion, and I'm going to ask you, you're in the media. We're both not in mainstream media. You're at the Intercept. I'm at the Young Turks. So it's independent media that tries to hold people accountable. We do this old school thing sometimes called reporting, where we care about facts. But in the mainstream media, guaranteed that if Biden loses, they will not say, hey, Mehdi warned that he was Hillary Clinton 2.0. Cenk warned that he's about the only candidate who could lose to Donald Trump. They'll say it was our fault because we dared to criticize the establishment candidate 5% too much in the primaries. We warned about the iceberg of his mental decline. They'll say if it wasn't for you, the iceberg wouldn't exist. They'll say, we're predicting it ahead of time. I predicted it ahead of time last time. We did it. We're doing it again. So isn't the number one problem that the mainstream media is totally and utterly broken? And if they weren't broken, we wouldn't have these results. We might actually have a decent Democratic candidate.
Well, if the mainstream media wasn't broken, we wouldn't have Donald Trump as president. I mean, I don't believe Trump could have been president had it not been for the ridiculously fawning coverage, the free coverage, the nonstop rallies, and the lack of scrutiny that he got in 2015 and 2016. So for a start, you wouldn't have Trump. And then when it comes to the Democratic Party, you're right in terms of, the accusations. And, every time I point out a problem with Joe Biden on Twitter or anywhere else, the first response is, what about Bernie? And my point is, forget about Bernie. Bernie could pull out tomorrow, as you and I just discussed. He might pull out tomorrow. If he pulls out, the argument won't be, what about Bernie? The argument is, there is a problem with this candidate, separate to Bernie Sanders, separate to anything else. And I've made it very clear. I would take Amy Klobuchar, Mayor Pete, Cory Booker, Kamala Harris. I would take any of these quote-unquote centrists over Joe Biden. This is not about ideology anymore. Of course, I prefer a more progressive candidate. Of course, I'd prefer a Warren or a Sanders. But the reality is right now, as you and I just said, you have a candidate who's extremely weak, looks eminently beatable in Joe Biden. And therefore, yes, I would take someone who's not in decline, who's got more of a killer instinct, who seems to know what's going on, who can operate a computer. And I just think, yes, there will be a lot of blame game go around. I think it's outrageous that after 2016, where they ran Hillary Clinton, the party comes back and runs Hillary Clinton 2.0 and then attacks the left, saying the left is unelectable, which seems weird. Can you imagine if Bernie had been the candidate in 2016 and then lost to Trump? You and I would have been told to shut up forever, and no left winger would even be allowed to run. They'd never been considered. And yet this time round, yet again, if the Martian landed on Earth, they would wonder what on earth is going on here. How have you learned so few lessons from 2016 that you can run such a similar candidate, similar campaign again? It's bizarre, beyond bizarre. What I would say, though, and this might be an unpopular view for some of your viewers, is that if it is a very narrow win by Donald Trump in 2016, if we see again, what was it, 77,000 votes in 3 states, which put him in the Oval Office, then yes, someone like me would say everyone needs to take responsibility for that. Yes, the Democrats ran a bad candidate. Yes, they may have run a bad campaign. But you know what? You can't just shirk your own responsibility as a voter. You may loathe Joe Biden, you may loathe Hillary Clinton, but you still have to make a choice. Ultimately, elections are not about your own feelings and how you feel. It's about whether you want your country to be a better place or a worse place, and you have to make decisions based on that. And I think everyone needs to be focused on, this is my personal view, getting rid of Donald Trump in November, who is an existential threat to American democracy in a way that no politician has been in modern American history as far back as I can remember.
Yeah, I hear you, Mehdi, but no. The responsibility is 100% on the Democratic Party.
You and I have to disagree on that. People have individual responsibility as well as members of the Democratic Society.
Hold on. No. Let me finish the thought. I am going to vote against Donald Trump, no matter what. I am. That's clear. And I'm going to make the case to vote against Donald Trump, no matter what, for the credible candidate against Donald Trump. But Anna made a devastating point on the show today, which is she thinks that the sexual assault allegations against Biden are very credible. And so now she says, you're asking me, a woman, to vote for someone who I think committed sexual assault. So thank you for putting me in this impossible situation. So if I and a lot of folks don't vote for Biden because we can't stomach it, it's not our fault. It's the fault of the Democratic Party that thrust this awful candidate on us.
No doubt. And I'm not excusing the Democratic Party for thrusting and it's not the party, it's also primary voters who made the mistake of choosing Biden as the electable person. Just on the sexual assault charge, allegations, let me just say this. You and I just mentioned this a moment ago. Should Bernie stay in or out? It's interesting that Bernie said not a word about this. If you're going to stay in and say you don't want Joe Biden to be the candidate, you need to reckon with this. Because once Bernie endorses Joe Biden, as he did with Hillary Clinton in 2016, people are going to ask him what he thinks about these allegations. He's not going to be able to stay silent. And it's madness that the Democratic Party are not prosecuting this now and not examining this now, because you think Donald Trump's not going to bring this up in the general election? Whether you think Tara Reade's allegations are credible or not, and I'm no one to judge whether they're credible or not, the point is that it is going to be an issue come the general election. Having said that, I would say, in response to Anna's point, unfortunately, liberals, progressives, Democrats, whatever you want to call it, across the world, have voted for men with horrible records. In recent years, Bill Clinton was accused of rape, accused of all sorts of. Many people lined up and re-elected him as president. John F. Kennedy had all sorts of allegations against him. So, unfortunately, the reason they're called lesser of two evils, Cenk, is because they're both evil.
All right, let's go on to your story because it's really important. So is the Trump team trying to start a war with Iran while we're all worried about coronavirus? Or is that overstating it?
Unfortunately, no, it's not overstating it. And you don't have to take it from me. As I point out in the piece, the New York Times got hold of a memo that was written by the top U.S. general on the ground, Robert White, in Iraq. He's the commanding officer of American forces working in the anti-ISIS coalition in Iraq. And he's written in a memo back to the Pentagon saying, if you keep telling me and my men to divert from our mission of fighting ISIS in Iraq and to go after these quote unquote Iranian-backed militias, these anti-ISIS militias that were backed by Iran, if we pick a fight with them right now, that is going to lead to war between Iran and the United States. A very tough, blunt memo written by the top commanding officer. And this is Mike Pompeo in D.C., Secretary of State. This is Robert O'Brien, National Security Advisor. And the Times says, based on their conversations with people in the administration, that these two men have been pushing not just for conflict with Iranian-backed militias, but with Iran on the basis that Iran's diverted by a pandemic right now. So let's take advantage of that. Think what a sick mindset you have to look at people dying in Iran. Iran is one of the worst hit cases when it comes to COVID-19 globally, certainly in the Middle East. An Iranian dying every 10 minutes, I believe, was the last stat I looked at. Thousands dead so far, tens of thousands diagnosed with the disease. Imagine looking at that situation and not saying, you know what, let's do all we can to help our fellow human beings, regardless of our political differences, but saying, no, now's a good time for a war. Oh, and by the way, we're going to put a new round of sanctions on you too, which Pompeo did a couple of weeks ago. As I said in an earlier piece on the subject of Iran, it's almost as if we're governed by sociopaths here in the United States.
Yeah, in one of your pieces, because you wrote a couple, you reminded me of something that is now looking back at it sounds a little remarkable. Back then, it was actually fairly commonplace, but in the Trump era of viciousness, it seems unthinkable. Remind us what happened in 2003 when there was an earthquake in Iran.
Yeah, so there was an earthquake in Bamiyan in Iran. Some of your viewers may remember it was a vicious earthquake. Tens of thousands of people died. And at that time, I think it was December, it was the end of the year, and just over New Year, George W. Bush was president of the United States. He had given his Axis of Evil speech. He had invaded Iraq. The Iranians were on the defensive at the time. And yet, Bush and his administration suspended the sanctions that they had on Iran. Sanctions on Iran go back a long way under different administrations of different parties. They suspended their sanctions and sent actual planes, cargo planes, military cargo planes, with supplies, with American doctors and personnel on board to Iran to help with the relief effort. It was the first time, I believe, American planes had landed in Iran since the revolution in 1979. And that was George W. Bush, a deeply vicious, deeply racist, warmongering president, supported by a soulless vice president in Dick Cheney. And yet even Bush Cheney said, hold on, there's an earthquake. Innocent people are dying. This is irrelevant to geopolitics. We can help them out and still hate them and still, demonize them and warmonger against them later. The Trump administration takes this disaster in Iran, another disaster, another humanitarian crisis, and says, behind the scenes, they say, let's ratchet up a conflict while they're distracted. And publicly, they say, you know what, we're going to put more sanctions on you. Imagine, it's bad enough that they have sanctions. People like Representative Ilhan Omar and other more progressive members of Congress have said, you need to suspend all these sanctions right now. Pompeo and co go the other direction. They say, no, we're not only not going to suspend them, we're going to bring in new sanctions in the middle of the worst public health crisis in modern history. It beggars belief. It's amazing. And, you go back to your point about low information voters and Joe Biden. Think about low information voters in US foreign policy. The only way elites in this country can get away with that they do around the world is because people have no clue, don't follow it, don't understand it, don't read about it, don't get told about it. I refuse to believe that the majority of Americans in this country would be, including many Republicans, I would argue, would be okay if they discovered what the government is doing in their name to Iranian women and children, to Iranian doctors who can't get equipment or face masks or gowns, not because there's a shortage like there is here, but because the United States government is blocking other countries from supplying it to Iran. It's outrageous.
Look, there's so many things that the actual people wouldn't be in favor of if they knew it. Someone, credible reporting says it might have been the government of Israel, assassinated an Iranian physicist in front of his kids as he was picking them up from kindergarten. And just because he was one of the top physicists in Iran. Okay, is that what we do? Is that a great ally of ours? We don't know for sure that it was Israel. But whoever did it is monstrous. But we hide the things that go bump in the night if it's on our side. Look, and you're right, it is cross-party. Obama executed American citizens abroad without any judicial process, and the establishment gave him a standing ovation for it. Now, again, there are different layers and different levels, and Trump is, of course, more monstrous than even Dick Cheney, as you point out. So in this case, the top commander in Iraq, our commander, is warning about it. So, Mehdi, tell us, if they do go down this path of more conflict and war, what form would it take?
So that's a great question. And people have been arguing about this for a while. What would an American-Iran war look like? Because it's been on the table for so long, since the early 2000s. There have been war games. There have been scenarios put out by Pentagon war planners, by various think tanks in DC and across the world. And none of them are good. None of them come out with any kind of positive ending. You'd be surprised and shocked to discover, Cenk, they all end disastrously in some shape or form, either for the Americans or for Iranian civilians or both. And there are levels, because here's what's interesting. The hawks in DC, John Bolton and co. and others, have always said, you can do limited targeted strikes on Iranian nuclear facilities and it'll be fine. They won't respond. On the other hand, they tell us that Iran can't have nuclear weapons because they're run by crazy suicidal fanatics. You can't have it both ways. Either they're run by crazy suicidal fanatics, in which case, if you attack them, they will go crazy and attack you back, or they're rational actors, in which case, why are you attacking them in the first place? So it's very bizarre, the contradiction that's presented. In terms of the ground war, what's going on right now, what O'Brien and Pompeo are pushing for are attacks on Iranian-backed militia groups in Iraq, because these groups have been ratcheting up their attacks on US personnel in Iran. Now, here's what's interesting, Jay. As you point out, people don't follow the news. It's always year zero. It's always day one. These attacks by the militias on the Americans are not the beginning either, because then you go back to New Year's. What happened at New Year's? Trump and co. assassinated not just a top Iranian general, Qasem Soleimani, and risked a war then. They also killed the commander of the Iranian-backed militias in Iraq, who was with Soleimani in that convoy. So, of course, those attacks were supposed to be, what were they? Acts of deterrence. The Trump administration told us we did this to establish a deterrent effect. Of course, it had no deterrent. It did the opposite. Like every time the Americans carry out a strike abroad, there's always blowback. The opposite was that these militias obviously are now attacking American soldiers in greater numbers. So what's fascinating is the Trump administration talks about maximum pressure. The problem with maximum pressure is that, A, it doesn't work, but not only does it not work, the response is always to go up, is always to escalate, not de-escalate. So we kill one of yours, you kill two of mine, we kill three of yours, you kill one of our top people, we kill your general. Where does it end? As you say, it could end in a full-scale confrontation between these two sides. What would that look like? Well, most military experts say that would make Iraq and Afghanistan look like a walk in the park. Iran is not Iraq. It has much more advanced defense systems. It has proxy groups throughout the world that are ready to attack its opponents on its behalf. It could send the global economy down the toilet, but the global economy is already going down the toilet. So imagine if you get oil and gas prices shooting up even more in this current coronavirus moment. So on every level, economic, political, humanitarian, a war with Iran would be a disaster. And that's why I wrote the piece, because the idea that O'Brien and Pompeo, egged on by Bolton on Twitter, we can just, we just kill a few more militia leaders in Iraq. It'll be fine. It won't lead to World War III. That kind of complacency is deeply disingenuous and deeply dangerous.
In a movie, if you had someone saying, hey, this country's in a lot of trouble, our adversary here, because they're beset by a pandemic, it's a humanitarian crisis, you got people dying left and right, so let's do a sneak attack on them while they're weak. That person in the movie is not the good guy. That person is the
villain. He would be the evil supervillain.
Yeah, that's right. So that's the situation we're in. Everybody check out Mehdi Hasan's writings at The Intercept. Also check out his podcast, Deconstructed, and, of course, his show on Al Jazeera English up front. Mehdi, thank you for joining us. Appreciate it.
Thanks so much, Cenk.
The TYT Plus app is now available on iOS and Android. Download to get more TYT content at tyt.com/app.